Personal examples: when I started in my career, I wanted to do almost anything to progress. I'm currently working as an engineer for Chevron in the production space. The way I got introduced to the oil and gas industry is that I am a product of women in STEM initiatives. I've worked for a number of companies of different sizes, and I got my bachelor's degree, then I got my 10 years of experience. Then I also got 2 master's degrees, one in petroleum engineering, and then one an MBA at the University of Chicago. Questions that we try to answer, or at least what keeps me up at night in the operations space: how do we keep production up? How do we limit the downtime? How do we limit wells that need to be repaired or wells that are shut in? Those are day-to-day operations questions. Common themes that help women not just weather the storm, but also thrive. I think women showing the balance of grit, but also it's okay to take a break or not always be functioning at all cylinders. Setting your boundaries is really important to explain to many young women.
Welcome to the Executive Connect podcast. I have with us today Yogashri Pradhan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So can you give the viewers just a background on how you got in the oil and gas industry and, kind of a brief history of time for your career?
Sure, I'll try to be as concise as possible. I don't have any family in the oil and gas industry, so I'm first generation. The way I got introduced to the oil and gas industry is that I was I am a product of women in STEM initiatives. I went to an all-girls engineering camp before I went to high school, and I was introduced to oil and gas there. So I kept petroleum engineering in the back of my mind. Then as I became a junior in high school, there were these opportunities to be in a mentorship program where select high school students get to write a research paper in a career that they've chosen at the time and they want to pursue. And then they pursue a spring internship with they seek working opportunities and pursue a spring internship in the Houston area. So I was selected for that program. I chose petroleum engineering because I remembered it from the STEM camp. And then I wrote a paper on, I don't know how I combined CO2 sequestration and then the CO2 flooding together, but I did. Those are two completely separate topics, but with all the public information that I was exposed to, I did my best as a 17-year-old. Then I had a consulting firm that read my research paper, that was impressed and wanted to take me under their wing to pursue a spring internship with them and then a summer internship. It was smooth. I mean, when I say smooth sailing, that would be a lie, but the rest is really history, where after that, I've worked for a number of companies of different sizes, and I have 10 years of oil and gas experience. During those 10 years, I've also gotten, my bachelor's degree. Of course, I got my bachelor's degree, then I got my 10 years of experience. Then I also got 2 master's degrees, one in petroleum engineering, and then one in an MBA at the University of Chicago, the Boot School of Business. I'm currently working as an engineer for Chevron in the production space.
Okay. And your work there is focused on data analytics. Is that correct?
That is correct. I do a lot of work in not just pulling the data, but analyzing the data, telling a story with the data, getting more context of the data. We have large volumes of data.
Okay. And, is that relatively new to the oil and gas industry, or have the techniques changed? I know that, we're talking about the last 10 years here, but there's been a lot of different stuff that's come in the data analytics space in the last 10 years, I'm sure. Has that changed the industry at all, or how has that impacted how oil and gas gets done?
That's a great question. Sure, in my span of 10 years, there have been a lot of changes, but the oil and gas industry has always had a wealth of knowledge or a wealth of data, I would say. And with that wealth of data, the question ends up being, there are multiple questions actually. How do we get how do we get the data to tell the story that we want to? So how do we mine that data? How do we get that data in a format to where we could do analytics? You've probably heard a lot where the majority of an engineer's time when it comes to data is literally just cleaning the data or getting the data and then spending very little of the time doing the analytics portion of it. When in reality, we want to spend less and less time doing all the housekeeping and then more time on the fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm assuming that might be more challenging in the oil and gas industry than in another industry too. So trying to get the data that you want, the format that you want it. Can you talk a little bit about the peculiarities of that in the oil and gas industry?
Sure. It depends on the vintage of the data too. So every single time you get data, whether if it's whether if it's geology data, whether if it's production data, it's not always in the format that you want it, that you can extract and do the data analytics and the data science. There's been a lot of technologies that help in terms of extracting that kind of data to get it in a format that we'd like to accelerate those learnings or to accelerate the stage between extracting, mining, and then actual data analytics. So there are technologies that are out there. I would say the oil and gas industry is pretty unique in that sense where when it comes to adapting data analytics techniques and data science techniques, yes, the oil and gas industry has a ton of data. But as far as the integration of data science and data analytics, compared to other industries, I would say the oil and gas industry was relatively late in that. But I would say that once oil and gas was introduced to data science and data analytics, I think there was an immediate embrace, and then what more can we do from there? But you also have the school of thought saying, well, this is a black box. There are these algorithms, and we could unpack that a little bit to the point where you have to understand the intent of what are these techniques are needing to do, and then understanding the methodology, building more transparency, and then trying to figure out whether if it will help you make if whether if that incremental insight or that incremental information could help you make the decision that you've been trying to make. So, lots of questions that have left to be answered when it comes to data science and data analytics spaces, but I would say that is some context of the rate of adoption.
Ready to lead smarter and invest wiser? On the Executive Connect podcast, we unpack executive strategies for wealth and influence. Hit the subscribe button now. Don't just watch, act.
So can you talk a little bit about the practical problems just for our listeners, that might not be as familiar with the oil and gas industry as you are? I mean, you do this all day long. Like, what are the practical decision points that you're trying to get to with the data as you're analyzing it and you put it through some process? Are you trying to get to a better pay zone? Are you trying to get to, drill in a different place? Or like, what sort of decisions are you guys trying to make? Or would any oil and gas operator be trying to make with these data analytics techniques that you're referring to?
I'm going to start answering it in a very annoying way. The
Okay.
annoying answer is it depends. So it depends on who you ask, and it depends on the company's life cycle or where the stage is in its development. And it really does depend on where you are, whether if it's a conventional or unconventional asset. But there is a common answer to all of that. So with that being said, the questions that we try to answer, or at least what keeps me up at night in the operation space, how do we keep production up? How do we limit the downtime? When I say downtime, how do we limit wells that need to be repaired or wells that are shut in, for example? So those are day-to-day operations questions. If I put my reservoir engineering hat on, I would ask the question, how economic is the development? Is it worth pursuing a development? Is it what's the scalability of the development or even the technology that gets applied to enhance production, to enhance the economics? Yes, what I think a lot of this is driven down to is what are the economic metrics I'm trying to optimize for. So, regardless if you are in the production space or in reservoir engineering, I mean, the fact that you're in oil and gas, you're trying to optimize the how do you perpetuate the value? How do you increase the value? How do you increase that reliability to, I mean, to the stakeholders?
Okay. And I guess on the upstream exploration side, for people that might be investing in new assets, how could they use some of the data that you guys come up with to be able to de-risk an investment or, think about risk in terms of where they want to place their money and, specifically for maybe like a fund or somebody that was looking to invest across a multiple different operators. If one of those operators had a data person versus somebody else that didn't have a data person. Can you talk a little bit about how that would help to de-risk an investment potentially?
That's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot going in my mind right now when it comes to what I wish people knew before they put their money down when it
Sure.
comes to oil and gas investment. So I do have a wish list, and I can tie it back to value. My wish list is understanding the intent of a company's development life cycle and see if it aligns with the with those who are investing. The other caveat I want to make is this is coming from an engineer's perspective. This is not coming from someone who is going to convince analysts or shareholders or anything like that. So anything I say, don't invest in something, that is along legalese that you tend to get on slides for presentations when someone is giving a talk like that. So I gave the short form of that. But with that being said, a wish list that someone who is interested in investing, as far as data goes, I get asked this question quite a bit on LinkedIn, surprisingly enough. Like, I get a lot of bankers asking me questions on, like, "Hey, what do I need to know? What are some of the insides? What's the juice? Is it worth the squeeze?" So,
Right.
and I mean, I can't disclose all that, but what I do wish is trying to get all as many data sources as possible. And when I say data sources, I'm talking about what are hubs of public data seeing, and what are they providing to you? What are the pros and cons of using those public data sources? What are some of the limitations in Texas when it comes to water data, for example, versus New Mexico? There's all sorts of questions. And I think it also depends on who do you have a relationship with when it comes to the operator that is providing the data to the public data source. So for example, if you have a relationship with multiple operators, you can learn about their operating philosophy. They can give you something, a general operating philosophy in their intent. They could also show what stage they are in their company growth, and that is reflective in their development. It is not only about what can I get in the next 6 months? What did you do in the last year? How does that fit to the big picture of the company's life cycle is a really important context to have. And if that aligns with if that aligns with the investment strategy, then I think then the conversation can be continued. But I mean, I would say what kind of data is needed. I would different sources of public data where where they provide the production data, where they provide the log data, whether if they provide even economic data. Some public sources provide even economic data.
Right.
Then you have the IR presentations where, I've seen tools where they've extracted different kinds of information from IR presentations, a lot of scraping that gets involved. So that's really interesting to see. So what are these companies talking about? What are they not talking about in their presentation? So it's very insightful to see what are they not talking about versus what they're talking about. And what are their commitments? Are they holding up to their commitments? Have they traditionally held up to their commitments? So, company history, different sources of public data, seeing if it converges to a conclusion, the different types of subdiscipline data, such as you're looking at reservoir data, production data, the geologic data, how the wells have been developed, how they were completed, how they were drilled, the operator relationship, and then finally, of course, it's whatever the economic data is available. So that's my wish list.
Are you a high-income professional looking for smarter ways to protect your wealth? The Texas Freedom Fund gives you the opportunity to invest in energy assets leveraging proven fracking technology and prime access to global markets. With strategic oil and gas investments, you can build real wealth while benefiting from tax advantages under laws dating back to the Reagan era. Take control of your financial future. Visit texasfreedomfund.executiveconnectpodcast.com.
Yeah, no, I think that's important for, somebody that's in the industry and this is what they do for a living is the data piece. knowing what the overall wish list is and not just taking what somebody is serving up to you as gospel, but trying to triangulate that data across multiple sources and then being able to very pointedly ask, hey, what about this piece of information? And sort of feel out the response that you get. Might be them not wanting to share that because it's not as favorable of a story that it's getting painted for that piece of data versus one of the other ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the industry's move to sustainable energy and your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I've seen I think in my 10 years, I've seen the most acceleration in this space, in sustainability or even discussions of sustainability. Some things to keep in mind when it comes to sustainability is they're different entities that have different criteria to evaluate a company when it comes to ESG metrics. So, what I mean by that is I had one of my first lectures in my MBA classes, we were looking at different entities, ESG metrics, how they evaluate a company, and how different entities evaluated a particular company and their ESG score. It's all over the place.
Right.
But with that being said, I don't know if the solution is to optimize for those particular metrics. I don't think so. I'm saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to sustainability. But that isn't to say we cannot let up on our safety. We cannot let up on com- like social or environmental, social, and governance. And we can't let up on those initiatives because they are important. I think the oil and gas industry does have a social responsibility. When I say that, they've always had a social responsibility in the sense that you're providing energy, low cost energy, affordable energy around the world. So there's that commitment. We start with that foundation. And the conversation has shifted to how can we produce those barrels safely? So how do we get people that are closest to the wellhead to their families home each night in one piece?
Right.
So oil and gas has been notorious for I'll be honest, like there's a lot of stories in the oil field when it comes to people saying, show your 10 fingers. Who has all their 10 fingers? Like there are those challenges and there are those questions. So we've come a pretty long way, I would say. Like you don't have to show your 10 fingers to see like who has their battle scars or who doesn't have their limbs or anything like that. But I would also say that we have there is an increasing responsibility of producing barrels safely. There's an increasing responsibility of delivering on social commitments. How do we do community outreach to places where we have established oil and gas businesses? And how do we improve those communities and uplift those communities and engage in those communities? And then how do we interact with stakeholders who, again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder? How do we engage with those stakeholders to further educate about the industry as well? I mean, I think on those fronts, the oil and gas industry a has made a lot of progress in that space for especially for sustainability. You hear a lot about the UN sustainability goals. You hear a lot of companies that are trying to align with those sustainability goals as well, and also leaning on technologies to improve the environment, leaning on technologies to improve that social responsibility and to lead with the data to show to stakeholders of how they're making that improvements in sustainability. So I would say that there's been a lot of progress especially when it comes to leaning on technologies in policy and then even in mindset within the company on that this is important.
Okay. Do you have a viewpoint on peak oil and where we are in the cycle right now?
I don't know if I'm supposed well, when I say I don't know, I say I think I'm jaded by the fear of peak oil. And here's what I mean. In the 70s, we've heard about Hubbard's peak.
Right.
And I think a lot of it had to do with the technology that was known, that was available affordably to get those barrels out of the ground. When the shale revolution happened in the mid 2000s, that's when peak oil was, I mean, for the most part, has been debunked, but that was just a nail in the coffin. When we could untap unconventional resources in an economic way, started in the Barnett, and then, the Permian Basin has stacked pay. So it was, I mean, I can go on and on about the history of unconventional resources. I don't think peak oil I think there's gonna be another technology that we can economically use to untap oil and gas resources. The question is who's gonna pull the trigger. The question is who cracked the nut and hasn't publicized it yet. And I I wanna see the next wave of how peak oil is going to be debunked. I think it is going to be debunked again.
No, I tend to agree with you. Do you have a viewpoint on you using the technology we have now in some of the other countries where maybe they just aren't using it? Um, the unconventional technologies that for whatever reason, like land rights issues or economic reasons that people just aren't using it in those countries and how that might play into the peak oil conversation?
I think a lot of it has to do there's so many factors. We hear about regulation, we hear about policy, you hear about how do we balance sustainability, environmental safety with also getting the resource, low cost energy. So there are many factors that are perceived to have worked against each other, and you need to find an optimal solution to how do we adhere to policy regulations? How do we influence that to get low cost energy? How do we y- what kinds of technologies have been discovered like there's a potential but it is just not feasible or economic yet to increase the scalability of untapping the billion barrels of oil that are still in the ground. So what kinds of technologies would do it? That's a great question. Thought a lot about that. And there's some areas enhanced oil recovery can help. And you hear a lot about CCS, CCUS to support those efforts. I think it's in the tertiary recovery space. And to clarify what I mean by that, I would say it's that enhanced oil recovery. I think that investment in enhanced oil recovery, a technology that we've been using for many decades in the oil and gas industry and conventional assets, I think could make a comeback in the unconventional space.
Okay. Yeah, you talked a little bit about the STEM space, and sounds like that might be a passion of yours that for young women coming up in the industry. We have a lot of executive women that are our viewers on this podcast. So, can you give them any advice about what you might how if their daughters or I guess their sons too, but they're mainly their daughters wanted to get into the energy space. Could you give them any advice in terms of what guidance you would have them give their children?
I've been thinking about this question too because there's the first thing that comes into my mind is that they're generational differences. So the challenges that, women who are postured to give the advice are going to be different to like, or even different to their children, are going to be different to the women who are seeking career advice. But there are some common elements. So, common themes that help women not just weather the storm, but also thrive. I would say, I think women showing the balance of grit, but also it's okay to take a break or, not always be functioning at all cylinders. Setting your boundaries is really important to explain to many young women because a personal example is when I started in my career, I wanted to do almost anything to progress. And when I say that, I mean work investment banking hours, work any project that comes my way, help out in any capacity that I can. To some extent, I do that, but I do set bound. When I say that, I mean the variety of projects I work on. But I do have, but over the years, I've learned about the importance of setting boundaries. I've learned about the importance of working smarter and not harder. And it's I think the other message to tell the women is it's not always it you don't have to come straight off the bat with a chip on your shoulder. You don't need to start in the you don't need to start with a mindset that you have a chip on the shoulder, that you need to prove something to people. Telling women that the word that comes into mind, that they're complete, that they are capable, that they are well equipped, that they have the tools, that they don't need anything to fill a void in them when it comes to professional growth is very important. So coming from a sense of fullness instead of abundance, instead of coming from a sense of scarcity, is very important to message to younger women. I think that's important because a lot of the messages that I hear from women of different generations is that you got to work harder, you got to do this, you got to do that. So there are elements of grit there. But I think shifting the message to you already have what it takes. You you control the narrative. Society doesn't control the narrative. I think that can be really empowering. So that's what I want to share.
Okay. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your podcast and what you do on your podcast?
Sure. Well, I have a YouTube channel and I have a podcast. I've been more active on the YouTube channel than I have been on the podcast, admittedly. But the motivation behind the podcast is I love reading technical papers. I don't know if I'm one of the few people who love reading very technical papers.
I think
Did I realize, pardon?
I think you may be, yeah.
I think so too. But I also know that some of this, some of the published work is hard to action because a lot of people don't understand it, or a lot of people don't want to do the due diligence of reading a 20-page paper. So I wanted to create a podcast to make that technical information insightful and accelerate it to if there's any action that can come out of it, there's any application or any appetite in the industry to take that finding and run with it. I think that would be really powerful. So I interviewed the authors of those technical papers. I go off of all published work of technical papers, and I've also interviewed technical leaders in the industry because you hear a lot about their published work, but you don't hear a lot about their stories.
Right.
And a lot of the people who do get interviewed take a management track. What about the people with a technical track? What about those stories? So that's the motivation behind the podcast.
Okay, what's the name of the podcast?
Petro Papers.
Petro Papers. All right. All right. Well, thanks for that. Is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with before we wrap up here?
I think the one thing that I want to leave with listeners with is whether if the motivation to hear this podcast on you want to convince your daughter to pursue STEM, you want to progress in your career, you want to get a better understanding of a particular subject in the industry, I will advise that it takes a lot of grit. It does take resilience. And I think it also takes a lot of open-mindedness to hear different perspectives. And it's not, I also will want to say it's not always about being liked because not everyone's going to like you, but it is about being understood.
All right. Well, thanks for that. And thanks for everybody for watching today. And that's the Executive Connect podcast.